Hi, so we're going to talk about research, reading it, understanding it, and putting it to use. So let's just get started by saying first off that reading research articles straight through and not stopping is not necessarily the best way to go about it. So if you have a research article, you need to think about it like an iterative process. You're going to take the time to read these papers in a way that helps you actually digest the information in them and figure out whether you need to read the whole paper without wasting your time reading a whole paper if you don't need to. So first off, the differences between two different kinds of papers. You've got scholarly papers, and then you've got all the rest of the reading that you do in your life. Scholarly papers, they are signed, the author has expertise in their field, their institutional affiliation is noted and verified, they're cited and they're referenced, and they're made for a special audience. There's a peer review process that acts as a check on just anything hitting the scholarly airwaves. What's important here is to note that it's different from looking up just any article you find anywhere, which could be unsigned, might be written by somebody who's not trained in the field or who we don't really even understand what their training is. Usually there are no references, or if there are references, they're sparse or they're not necessarily from the best sources. So they may be citing from other popular culture media. They're usually written for a mass audience. They can be a great way to get your feet wet in a topic and just understand whether you're interested in it, but it's not what you want for your scholarly paper. The last reason is that it may have been written for a website that gets paid to put certain articles up. If they don't disclose that, or even if they do disclose that, you don't know for sure whether that payment has affected what they've put up on the website. So this is also a limitation in the academic world. It's important to say that just because a paper is scholarly and we can cite it doesn't mean it's all the information that there is on a topic. There are classist and systemic injustice reasons that make academia difficult to attain for everyone. And I just want to call attention to the fact that over the course of your scholarship, I hope that you dive deeper into some of the ways that you can include material that is not classically understood as scholarly, but understanding how to do that and how to do the background checks that you need to know, and how to cite the things that you would need to. That's sort of next level work. So if you want to get into that, we can talk about it. You can contact me separately and we can dive into what you might do if there's an area of interest for you that isn't necessarily held only in the scholarly realm. Okay, so types of research. There's two types of research you're going to be looking at when you pick your topic. You're going to go looking for papers, and you're going to find quantitative or empirically counted. It focuses on the measurable, or qualitative work, which focuses on the descriptive. So both of these types of research are valid and valuable, especially for psychology. Quantitative work focuses on what we can measure, on counting things, on a statistical paradigm. There tends to be a large sample size. Larger is usually considered better. I guess they're size queens in this way. The ontological or underlying assumption from a quantitative perspective or in a quantitative paradigm is that the world can be observed, that we can look at something, we can measure it, we can calculate. Now, in a qualitative paradigm, we focus on the descriptive. We gather narratives and observations. It helps us get at data that's not as countable. It uses a narrative paradigm. There tends to be a smaller sample size, which means that there's higher variation. Smaller sample size can mean a lot of different things. You may find some samples of one. You may find a case study, for instance. You may find some samples, like an interpretative phenomenological analysis, that's apt to have, say, 6 to 12 participants. However, and so say a quantitative account might have hundreds of participants, thousands if they're really lucky, but they might only have dozens. What's important to note here is that quantitative work has to be things that can be measurable, and qualitative work is generally things that are describable. They're how people make meaning out of their lives. Questions that, well, how do you measure meaning exactly? Qualitative studies tend to have much smaller sample sizes. That doesn't make them inherently less valuable. It makes them different. A qualitative study rests on the ontological assumption that the world is experienced and can be known through description. These two, they're not exactly opposites. I think of them as types of ways of knowing, ways of coming to understand our world that they complement each other. Don't think about them as this one's better than that one. Depending on the question that's being asked, one or the other may make more sense. If I were doing a classical physics study, I would be literally measuring something. It would make sense to use a quantitative paradigm. If I were counting something like, say, how many cisgendered gay men accessed pornography during the year 1998, I'm counting a thing. That would make sense to use a quantitative paradigm. If instead I'm asking a question like, how many cisgendered gay men accessed porn in a way that they found was disruptive to their overall sex life? Well, now I need to question, what does disruptive mean? What does it mean that they found it disruptive? So that's a qualitative, a descriptive study that would have to be run. Now, you're going to be looking for papers for a human sexuality paper. You may find that sexuality as a field and the journals relevant to the sexuality field themselves, like the Journal of Sex Research or the Marriage and Family Therapist journals, you may find those have great papers for you. But you may find that your research bumps up against another field, like human sexuality can bump up against health studies, policy studies, anthropology, social work, sociology, medicine, religion, ecological studies, counseling, neuroscience. Don't rule anything out. If you pick a research topic, it doesn't necessarily have to be a sexuality only study that you look at to include to just understand the topic better. It might take more than just sexuality studies. So now that we're talking about topic, the two words topic and question, these come up right away when you're going to write a research paper. When you set out to find information, you're generally looking for information about a specific topic. For example, you might be looking to learn more about orgasms or erections or sexual desire mismatch. These are topics. Each topic will likely have many different articles devoted to the exploration of that topic, but each will have been started with a distinct research question. And knowing how to look for the research question that the researcher started with helps you figure out whether that paper is right for you. For example, if I wanted information on orgasms, I might find an article titled Sexual Desire, Erection, Orgasm, and Ejaculatory Functions and Their Importance to Elderly Swedish Men, a population-based study. That's the title of a real study. Now, this one is definitely about orgasm, right? This paper is certainly about orgasm. But if what I wanted to find out about was orgasmic pleasure in middle-aged cisgender females, this article is probably not going to be any use to me. In this case, I can just rule it out by the title, but sometimes the title of an article doesn't give us enough to know whether the article is relevant for us. So we're going to go over the steps to figuring out exactly what the researcher's question was, which is the beating heart of any research paper. The question is how we grappled with the problem. So as a researcher, I come up with a question, and that's where I make meaning. That's the first step that I undertake when I'm making new knowledge. So once we get to that section, we can figure out what you'll be looking for. But first, accessing scholarly articles. What do I mean by scholarly? I mean not Wikipedia, for one thing. Why not Wiki? I know you've heard this before, you're already in college, but why not? Because anyone can edit it. There's no requirement for the authors to identify themselves. Regulation is weak at best, and Here, in Wikipedia's own words, they say, Wikipedia can be a great tool for learning and researching information. However, as with all reference works, Wikipedia is not considered to be a reliable source. They say this themselves. And not everything in Wikipedia is accurate, comprehensive, or unbiased. That's Wikipedia talking about Wikipedia. That's a very responsible statement to put out. You are responsible for using scholarly resources in this course. If you're not certain whether something is a scholarly resource, I encourage you to ask the librarians or ask me. If you're not sure, err on the side of caution. Okay, how do you access these? Well, turn to your library. You guys have a great library, you have great librarians, you're an enrolled student, so you've probably already used the library. Use the databases. What do I mean by database? I mean, it used to be that when journals came out, they sat on a shelf and I would literally go and look up the article in the index that came out once a year for that journal, and I would go find the exact journal and I would turn to that and I would take it over to a copier and I would copy it. That's not it anymore. Now you go to the databases, you're gonna type in, you're searching. Your librarians can be a huge help to you, but you also have online tutorials. So go to hcc.edu, click on library. Right there, you see the link for databases. Get in there and start looking. If you found a scholarly article and you didn't know what to do, you didn't know how to get it, one option is actually, and this is a pro tip, it's that authors really want their research to be read. I know this because I like to have my research read myself. So if you come across an article, but you can only find the abstract or you can't get a hold of the whole article because your school doesn't subscribe to it, one option is to very politely look up the author on either researchgate.net or academia or on LinkedIn and write a nice polite letter asking the author if they have a copy that you can read. More often than not, they will send you their author copy. They're allowed to. Sharing research that way is completely fine. So that's just a pro tip for those of you who might have more obscure topics that you want to explore. Okay, so how are we going to find what we need? You're going to start by making a list of search terms. Learn to use search tools effectively. Do you need to use very recent literature? Well, for this course, it's going to depend on what kind of question you're asking. Like I said in class, I'm not going to give you a specific cutoff for the number of years. Sometimes a teacher will say, I only want you to use articles written in the last 10 years. Well, that's pretty simple. There's a little slide bar over on the left. You move that up to be 2010 to 2020, and you only search in those years. But for me, it matters more what your question is. So when I research jealousy, I need to go back and look all the way back to Melanie Klein and then into Freud. And then I need to look actually into like the Greek literature, the Greek mythology on jealousy. So I have to cover thousands of years. However, for a 4 to 6 page research paper like you're going to write for this class, it's not like you need to do an exhaustive literature review. But I also don't want you to think that it's true that in all cases, only the newest literature is relevant. Now, if you were studying, say, best practices for HIV prevention, well, best practices, you need those to be modern. If you were going to do a historical review of all of the practices for HIV prevention, then you'd want to look back to the early 80s because that's when HIV became known as a problem, and therefore we started trying to prevent it. So you have to think about exactly what it is you're doing in order to know what the relevant years will be. But next you need to figure out which search terms you need. Make a list, start with a list, and this little mind map kind of list in the picture I think is really helpful. One of the reasons I do this is to remind myself that just because I have called a particular phenomenon by one word doesn't mean all the literature is going to call it by the same word. So let's say I wanted to research intercourse pain. That could also be studied as vaginismus or vulvodynia or vaginal pain. Consent could be studied and discussed from legal and psychological and sociological angles, and they all use similar words, but the phrasing can be different. So get clear on what your interest really is and what field you're really interested in bumping up against, and that'll help you understand which words you should use for your searching. And then learn to use Boolean operators, which sound complicated, but really it's super simple. It's as simple as using the words and, or not. To refine your searches, you're going to use those search bars up at the top of the database once you've clicked in. And I recommend that you use like the SciInfo or SciArticles databases. And what you'll do is decide on how to, let's say, again, you're searching, maybe you want to search intercourse pain. So intercourse might be one of your words, but let's say you want to search that only in, maybe you only want to search that in trans women. Well, then you'd put and in between intercourse pain and trans women. Let's say you wanted to search, homoeroticism, but you wanted to exclude cisgendered men. It doesn't really matter. Then you'd use or. The terms that I'm choosing don't matter. The point is using and, or, and not really carefully can cut down the list. Let's say if you type in intercourse pain, you're going to turn up thousands and thousands of articles. You want to narrow that field as quickly as possible. So use and, use or, and use not. Using not is really helpful if you're, oh, let's see, I just helped somebody work on a paper where they wanted to talk about erectile dysfunction, but they wanted to talk about it outside of a medical paradigm. So they typed in erectile dysfunction, chose not as their Boolean operator, and then medicine, and not, and pharmaceutical, and not, and what else did they choose? Medicine, maybe it was just those two. But then she also did and searches. So she did erectile dysfunction and the words natural, erectile dysfunction and the word mindfulness. And that helped her narrow down the results. So instead of turning up thousands of articles, she was only turning up dozens of articles to start weeding through. So the reason I talk about weeding out is because, let's be realistic, you don't have tons and tons of time. So we're going to talk about how to read articles and figure out which articles actually matter for you as quickly as is reasonable. So you're going to do this in 4 steps. First, you're going to read the title of the article. The next is you're going to locate the field. And the journal name usually gives this away. So if you're looking at the Journal of Sex Research, you are clearly in the field of human sexuality. If I'm looking at the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, if I'm looking at that, well, now I'm in medicine. But the article title might be exactly the same. So first read the title, then locate the field, and now just skim the abstract. Don't read it, just skim it and see if it has any resonance with your topic. Don't try to read every word of it, and there's a good reason why you don't need to. After you've skimmed it, if it seems like it fits in general, add it to your read pile. Otherwise, add it to your discard pile. And when I say piles, what I really mean is folders, because you're going to be using databases. So you want to add them to your read file. But you don't have to read everything yet. Once you have a stack of papers, or a virtual stack of papers, you found them in the scholarly databases. You've checked off the box that says peer-reviewed journal, so you don't turn up a bunch of junk that you can't use. If you're unsure about whether an article has enough scholarly chops to use, now's the time to double check the journal. Go look up the journal online. You can search the name of the journal and see whether it's peer-reviewed. If you're still not sure, ask a librarian or ask me, and we will help you figure it out. The information about whether a journal is peer-reviewed will be right on their website. So for this research paper, you're going to need at least 3 scholarly articles, and at least one of them should be quantitative. I want it to measure something. It is possible. It is possible that you are going to choose a topic to explore that there isn't a reasonable quantitative study to use. So this isn't a hard and fast rule, but that's only if your topic truly wouldn't touch the quantitative world. So come to me, talk to me. We'll talk about whether that's true or not. Don't just assume. Now, what about books? When we're talking about quality literature, what about books? Well, books can be tricky because each book is published, well, by whoever publishes it. And books have editors, but that doesn't mean they're peer reviewed. And there's so much self-publishing now, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it just means that we can't necessarily tell what the quality of the information is. I mean, heck, we ran into that with our textbook already. There is some data in that textbook that is definitely arguable. So be cautious when you choose books, and be cautious when you're choosing even scholarly articles. It's not like there won't be arguments and different points made. Use your critical thinking skills. Now, how to read a scholarly paper. There's a page uploaded for you to use for note-taking. You don't have to use this particular format if you don't want, but I'm going to encourage you to use this worksheet that has, it'll help you capture the relevant details about any given article so that you actually have it in a place. It's going to capture things like the citation and the field and the topic and things like that. So I would grab that, that downloadable. It's really helpful. And if you have a particular research interest that you think is going to follow you for a while, start making your library of research papers right now. I've been researching the same topic now for, well, a decade, really, and I've been researching it hard for 5.5 years. It was a big help to have already captured a bunch of this information. So it's never too early if an interesting topic has grabbed your attention. So how are we going to actually read these papers? First off, I want you to know that I don't expect you to read dozens and dozens of papers. I want you to actually be thoughtful about how you consume the literature, because you don't have endless time. I get that. So what I want you to do is, honestly, I would prefer you printed out the papers that look most relevant. When you followed those earlier 4 steps, you've checked to see that it's peer reviewed, you've checked the title, you've skimmed the abstract just to see if it resonates with your topic. And I would print out the best looking, say 5 or 6 of them, because there's something about being able to highlight and take notes in the margin that really helps us focus. But if you're going to do it online, it's fine, because I don't actually want you to highlight alone. I want you to take notes in your own words. When you take notes about a paper, it completely enters your knowledge base, your own understanding, in a totally different way. So you're going to go through the article step by step, and you're going to start bringing it into yourself. So the very first step is going to be to situate the article. You want to understand what field the paper comes from, and what do you think about, what do you know about this field, and what's the big picture questions that this field is trying to address. So for example, the sexuality field is currently grappling with a whole bunch of topics, like the nature of love, or the neurological requirements for long-term relationship satisfaction, the basis for gender, and whether gender is a stable or fluid concept. These are issues that are being researched all the time in human sexuality. But in the big picture, the sexuality field in 2020 seems to be attempting to shift the conversation from where it used to be set, which was largely on morality, into a conversation of a scientific and a plural nature, trying to understand the world through many ways of knowing. And in other words, the major research tends to lean heavily now on established research methods and basic understanding, rather than just ideologies. So that's how I think about the field. Now, if I were drawing a paper from criminology, I would want to take those same steps. Like, well, how is the field of criminology making sense of the world? It's going to help me understand where the author's coming from. Next step is to go straight to the introduction, not to the abstract. Don't go straight to the abstract. You've skimmed it to see if there's resonance, but don't read it all the way through. Go straight to the introduction. Read the introduction, which is likely in a paper to be a few, 3 paragraphs at most, sometimes just 1 paragraph. Pay attention to the very last paragraph, which is usually where the author will state exactly the problem that they're addressing. That's what's important for you right now. The third step, locate the research question. What was the question that the researcher was trying to answer? It's probably in the last paragraph of the introduction, or if there's only 1 introductory paragraph, it's probably toward the end of that. This question tells you so much about what you are about to read. Locate the research question and write it down. So you've written down the title, you've situated, you understand what field you're looking at, and now you've located the research question. So next we move on straight on to the method and methodology. So the methodology is the overall research approach. It's the underlying foundational assumptions that the researcher makes. So that matters a whole bunch, but you probably are more used to thinking about what the method was. The method is actually the tools that were applied to gather and analyze and interpret the data. So for my latest study, for instance, my methodology was a depth psychological approach, which means I was taking very seriously the unconscious factors in my research participant's life. But the method I applied was interpretative phenomenological analysis. This is a very specific tool that told me exactly which steps I needed to take to gather data. It told me how many participants I should have, how I would approach those participants, how I would gather them, how I would delimit people from the study, and then what kinds of questions I might want to develop and how many, how long the process should take. And it gives me every step that I need. So if you can identify which methodology, in other words, which approach, and then which method people are using, now you're sort of inside of the researcher's brain. You can start taking their stance on a little bit. So starting to understand the methods most common for your fields of interest, it'll give you a good knowledge base. You'll become a better consumer of scholarly literature this way. In some fields like physics and microbiology or pharmaceutical development, experimental design and quantitative methods absolutely rule. But in others like sociology, human sexuality, and psychology, there are ethical constraints about subjecting participants to controlled experiments. And that means that many times qualitative approaches are now also used. And so this is where it becomes important to just know the difference, know what you're looking at. Look at the method and see, am I looking at a study that counted something, or am I looking at a study that talked about how someone was making meaning, how somebody was making sense out of their life, how they were describing their experience? Those 2 things will really, really help you understand what's going on in the paper. And if all of these words start to feel like gobbledygook, there is a glossary with a bunch of research terms like analysis and causality and qualitative and epistemology. Download the glossary and keep it handy. I just stick it in the front of my notebook because I forget these words too. It's fine. Use it for what it's for. Now you have this stack and you've identified the basic qualities of say your favorite 5 papers. Now, what are you going to use these papers for? It's time to decide how much more you want to read. If you're undertaking serious study in this field, then you're going to want to read this paper really thoroughly. And you're probably going to want to undertake that in this order. You're going to read the methods, the results, the discussion, the interpretation, and the conclusions. That's pretty much how they'll be laid out. But if, however, you're a novice reader and you're just trying to develop information on a specific topic and you're not sure how committed to this topic you are and you want to read a bunch of papers, it might be more practical to take a careful and sort of surgical approach to how you read. We have limited time and resources. So you have to decide what parts of the research paper you're going to read, because sometimes it'll help you ditch a paper because it doesn't even make sense for you. So in this case, you would decide to read the results, discussion, and interpretation and conclusion sections only. However, the danger here, the really big danger, and this is the danger that people run into when they read the abstracts first as well, the danger is confirmation bias. If you jump right to the results or the discussion, it's possible that you'll disagree with what the researchers found. And if you do, you may decide that that paper isn't important for your research paper. But I'm going to say right now, it is far more interesting and more helpful for your understanding of a topic if you do find papers that diverge. Argue against them. Tell me why you think it's wrong. Show me another paper that says the opposite thing. That happens. If you find papers that argue with each other, use them. Use them to open each other up. Use those papers that you disagree with to open yourself up, open up your mind, and see if you can logically and carefully apply your thought to argue against their point. But whether you decide to take this on as a serious study article or just to get some practical, quick information, either way, you need to invest a little bit of time. So what I don't want you to do is jump straight to reviewing the abstract. Here's why. If you start with the abstract, you're going to run into confirmation bias. You're going to rule out papers that you disagree with, and you're going to spend far more time looking at papers that back up what you already believe to be true. That's not helpful. That's not helpful for any of us as researchers, and it's really not helpful when you're just getting used to the research process. If any of you think that you might perform more research in the future, get used to right now dealing with arguments against your thought process. If you don't think that you're going to do research in the future, get used to dealing with arguments to your thought process. It's going to help you in life. But let's say you have read through your paper and you've taken notes in your own words, because when you take notes in your own words, and it just has to be a few sentences, I'm not asking you to rewrite the paper. That would be completely against the point. Take a few sentences of notes about what the paper is about. Now go to the abstract, read it carefully. Does it resonate with your understanding? The abstract is going to be concise and it should be precise, but sometimes it isn't. Not everybody is great at writing abstracts, so they can be a little clunky. Also, they're often confined to like 200 to 500 words for an abstract, and sometimes even as few as 150. So they, by necessity, have to cut out lots and lots of words that might help you understand what the article is about. So the abstract should help you understand whether you understand the paper. That's why I say read it at the end. If you read the abstract and you're like, I don't even get it, it's time to review the paper again. And if you're running into this problem with a paper that seems really important to you, but you can't quite figure it out, that's when to ask the librarian, when to ask me. Get some help. Get some more eyes on that paper. It's also possible it's just really badly written. That happens. Don't rule it out. But get another set of eyes on it. Okay, so this is now a great time to think about response papers. When you were searching for articles to look at, you may have found one that had the title, and then there was another article with the same title, except it said a response to. Somebody read the original article and then they responded with their own article. Usually it's short. I often find these using Google Scholar. If they don't come up, I'll do a Google Scholar, not a regular Google search. I go to Google Scholar, google.scholar, just to see if anybody has responded about the paper, especially if the paper is like new within the last year, because response articles may not have made it all the way through the peer review process. That's just to get me thinking about what kinds of responses people in the field may have had. Obviously, if you're reading offsite, if you're reading outside of the databases, you're going to have to do more digging about the credentials of people writing response papers or response articles. So it's really an extra step, but if you're serious about a particular topic, I would absolutely take the time to do that. Now, the last section of this presentation, I just want to say that you matter in the research. You are entering into a conversation about a topic. I hope a topic that matters to you. When you engage in reading the research, you make the research come alive. If people don't read my research, what good was it really? So it matters to me a lot that people read my research, but it also matters that people think critically about it and go on to write their own papers. Yes, even in your first few years of college. The first step you can take to really take yourself seriously in this conversation is to situate yourself alongside the research that you're reading. Think about what preconceptions you have about the research question. Go back to that research question you found. You probably highlighted it. Hopefully you wrote it down on your worksheet. The researcher asked a question. What was it? And what do you think? What answer do you already have about that question? What are your biases around the methods that the researcher is undertaking? Do you have a particular bias one way or the other for or against qualitative or quantitative work? You might not have one now, but you might find after you read more that you start to develop one. Do some self-checks. Just keep an eye on who are you. You're part of the research. So think about those questions. And I like to jot them down as I'm going through a research process. Just jot down at the top of my notebook what I think about the topic right at the very beginning, because that'll help me write my conclusions later. Your thought process is going to change as you research something. So the next things that you want to think about are, well, you're going to want to look at the study itself and think about what the study, if the study was statistical or quantitative or qualitative or descriptive or correlational or experimental, think about how you would have asked the question. What would you have done? What kind of study just let yourself imagine, what kind of study might you have undertaken if you wanted to answer this question? And then think about what the limitations are of the study, and did the researcher actually address the limitations? Think about the limitations. All studies have them. For instance, it can be challenging for researchers to gain access to certain communities. It can be a difficult thing to gain access to certain kinds of medical data. It can be very difficult to access issues of sexuality in certain communities because people aren't allowed, or there's a proscription against talking about sex. Think about how you might have undertaken this same research. And then I want you to think about what other explanation there might be for the results that the researcher got. So you had assumptions when you started reading the paper, but then you read the paper and you read the results section. And I want you to consider what other explanation there might have been. What else could have been going on? So let's say the researcher found that the teen pregnancy rate in a particular state went down after they instituted an abstinence-only sex education program. And they're like, see, abstinence-only sex education works. Well, what if at the same time that happened, somehow, some way, that same state also made accessible birth control and access to abortion without parental permission? What if those are the factors that brought down the teen birth rate? We just need to take a broader view. Sometimes a researcher has a very narrow view, and they're allowed to, but you as the reader need to step back and think about what else could have possibly been at work. What other factors could have been at work? You need to think about the implications of the study, but also the implied causalities. Sometimes when a researcher is writing up their research, they They jump to a conclusion. But that can happen a lot in a graph or results section. There'll be this, or the researcher may not even jump to the conclusion, but you might, because you're just looking at a graph that seems to make one clear point. When you're looking at graphs and images, definitely take a step back and make sure that you're not jumping to a conclusion. And then, very important, what motivations can I find in the resources, in the researcher's funding? Not all researchers have to make clear if they received funding, but you may find a conflict of interest statement at the bottom, like on this slide. If there is, so this study right here, which was about cranberry used for urinary tract infections, and the efficacy has been controversial, and they go on, blah, 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 and they find a conclusion, and the conclusion suggests that cranberry may be effective in preventing UTI occurrence in healthy women. And then you look down here at the bottom and you see that they received grant funding from Ocean Spray Cranberries. So the funding source didn't have any role in the study design or contact or interpretation or reporting. However, it's worth noting that the Cranberry Company was part of the funding of this study. And I use that example because it's a little bit funnier than some of the really horrible examples that there are out there. Now, what motivated the participants? So this is an interesting way to engage in the research dialectic, because a lot of research participants are undergrad college students, specifically at large universities. Because a lot of times, if you have a big university, there'll be all these studies being run by professors, by research scholars at the university, and college students can earn credit to participate in a study, or they can just be exposed to a lot more studies that they might participate in. And so what you could find is that the participants were motivated to show up for reasons that have nothing to do with the research itself. And then think about whether the study seems generalizable. Could this group actually be assumed to be similar to the general population? Now, if you're doing a study and you use all undergrad college students, and the thing you're studying is use of condoms by undergrad college students, that's pretty reasonable. But if you were looking at condom use as a whole, and you only looked at undergrad college students who have access to an on-site health clinic and round-the-clock availability, I'm not sure how much you could generalize that study. And then the instruments. Instrument just means what tool did the researcher use. So if you can find that research question, that's helpful. But then also, each of the researchers, if they did a qualitative study, there will be somewhere the list of questions that they actually asked. You may find biases right in those questions. Nobody's perfect. Researchers are people. They do their best to bracket out bias, but it happens. So take a look. And then terminology can point you in the direction of biases. Like, did they ask questions in medical language? Did they use slang? Especially when it comes to studying sexuality, participants could be confused or not know how to answer a particular question if they didn't understand the terminology used. So those are worth looking at. And then, do the instruments actually seem to measure what the researcher thinks they measure? Like, if they were using an instrument that was designed to measure self-esteem, and they use that to measure sexual self-esteem, well, it's worth thinking about, is that translatable? Is that actually relevant? And there is no hard and fast answer. You, as the reader of the research, it matters. You have to think about it yourself. And then rapport. More participants given the impression of privacy and anonymity to the extent that they could, that was possible. Now, when a researcher is setting up their study, they have to provide informed consent for the people participating in the study. However, all things are not created equal. Take a look at what informed consent was provided and what participants expected to get out of privacy and anonymity. And was that enough to allow them to fully disclose? And also, did the researcher take the time to establish rapport with their participants? This may or may not be available to you, but if you can look at the list of questions that was asked, it can be really helpful to just note what it sounded like, what those questions sounded like, and whether the researcher discloses having established a certain level of comfort for the participant before they jumped into hard questions about sexuality. So I hope that you feel that this process is doable and that it looks reasonable. But if you have questions, please, please, please email me. I am not offline. I am online. Even if you happen to be watching this at a different time, you can always email me. You can email me jhamilton@hcc.edu. And I would be super happy to talk to you about any of this. So hope you guys have a great week. I hope that your annotated bibliography comes along really well and that it's not too horrifying a process for you. And I can't wait to read them. Bye, guys.